I am going to be mercilessly promoting the symposium for the next few weeks. It's free, it's virtual, you don't even have to leave your house. Please join us. We actually have over 400 registered, but I'm greedy and I want more than that. So if you look here, you can see all the different topic areas that we're including. We have several tutorials and super easy to register, and please join us. Thank you for letting me have my little pitch. Also, Haisu has suggested someone to be here today, and we worked really hard to make it work, and we're so glad. But I'm going to let Haisu make the introductions, please.
All right, thanks, Beth. Hello, everyone. So today we have Thais join us to give a talk on portable laser cuttings, some of the very impressive titles, transitioning from 1,000 seconds of user, 1,000 of users to millions of users. So Thais is my old friend when I visit Patrick College Lab in the Germany HCIL Institute. The couple of years ago, that's where we met. Thais, like me, is working in the area of technical HCI, digital fabrications, interactive fabrications, and he has been sort of a rock star in the field of waste conference and promoting a lot of technical advancement in terms of laser cuttings. I think he will give us some of the very interesting talks and about how to scale up the use of laser cutters and make everyone be able to become the creators. With that being said, I would just give this back to Thais, and let's welcome Thais. Thais, all yours.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Thijs Rauman, and I'm going to present on behalf of my co-authors and supervisor, Patrick Boudisch, and people from the HPI lab, my work on portable laser cutting. So when I started to do research into laser cutting, this is roughly what it would work like. You would send like this sort of 2D cutting plan to the laser cutter, and then the laser would sort of trace those paths, would cut it out, and then you would have like the result of what you're trying to fabricate. In this case, that would be a microscope. And there are many great things about this format. Like as you notice, it's like it doesn't make any reference to the specifics of the machine. It's very easy to read. You can encode different processes with different colors. So there are many great things about this. But today's talk, I'm going to argue why this format will have to go away, will have to die. And I'm going to make another proposal and a different way of approaching laser cutting. So before we go into more detail on laser cutting and the specifics of that format, let's talk about the field of digital computing, which we are all much more familiar with. So you've seen like charts like this, where the amount of devices or the amount of users have like sort of exploded over time. And you've seen that in different dimensions that are related to computing, right? But so like when as a researcher in digital fabrication, I try to look at these trends and see if there's anything I can take from that chart and see how that could possibly apply to digital fabrication. So one thing to note here is like with digital fabrication, we're far behind on that, right? Like we're still like sort of like starting to kind of get up the ramp, and then hopefully there is some sort of future where that exponential will kick in. But in order to get there, there are some like pivotal moments that need to kind of happen, that need to kind of have happened in the history of computing and will have to happen in the future of fabrication. And so like if we look at, for example, this moment here, this was the pivotal moment in the history of computing where we introduced mobility, right? So mobile computing. It's the moment where like we've transitioned from millions of users towards billions of users. Literally everybody since that moment has a mobile device. So I just like to kind of use that as a thought exercise to see like, oh, what would mobility mean in the context of laser cutting or fabrication in this case? So then we did like some sort of envisionment of what that future could look like. So I literally like took an existing, in this case, 3D printer with me and asked myself the question, what if we had 3D printers with us anytime, anywhere, and on the go? So here my bike lamp is broken. And I'm sort of trying to use the kind of placeholder technology that I took with me to solve that particular problem at hand. And that would be sort of the envisionment what that future could look like if we had mobile fabrications devices with us all the time. But that is a future, like as I said, it's a transition where we went from millions of people using fabrication to billions of people using fabrication. That's not exactly where we are yet, right? That would be like 4 decades down the line. We are still kind of at a point where we are like transitioning from thousands of users of digital fabrication to millions of users. That's another pivot that we have to make still. And that happened in the history of computing as well. So like if we look back further in history, there was a pivotal moment where we transitioned from thousands to millions of users. And that is what the research of my PhD is going to focus on, or has focused on. And that's what the papers that I will be presenting today will all kind of make reference to. And so what was that moment? What was that pivotal moment in the history of computing where we went from thousands to millions of users? When I asked that question to students at the introduction, when I teach an introduction to programming, I get like answers like object orientation or different shifts in programming languages that have happened in their lifetime somehow. But there has been an even more fundamental shift before that, which was the introduction of compilers. Right? When we introduced compilers, this is the first moment where we sort of abstracted away from the hardware of computers, and we went more abstract. So like the languages that have developed in that period, they are still around today, right? So that's like when C and Lisp and BASIC kind of came about, and these programming languages, they are still used as right now because they turned out to be like useful independent of the machines. Every code that was written before that was every time you would buy a new machine, the code was invalid, and this code stayed valid for at least much longer. So in the context of computing, we call this portability. We call this portability, which is the ability of software to be transferred from one machine or system to another. And typically you capture that in the form of a standard, which is an established norm or requirement for a repeatable technical task. So if you put that on a timeline, we had like in the 50s, we moved from a hardware specific implementation to portable implementations. And we've seen the same kind of transition happen in all different types of digital content fields. For example, in desktop publishing, the technology was around for a long time, but only since like 82, where PostScript was introduced and later Adobe introduced PDF, was the moment where portability kicked in, and therefore the content that was produced since that moment is still accessible right now. And you've seen the same with digital video, you've seen it with digital audio. Essentially any digital technology that has been around has had this point in time where we start to abstract away from the specifics of the hardware and then have content that remained relevant up till this moment in time. So if the portability is the ability of something to be transferred from one machine or system to another, then in the context of laser cutting, that would be the ability of models, laser cut models, to be transferred from one machine or system to another. So let's look at where we stand with that right now, right? Because I already showed you this amazing format, right? Like we had these vector files, and to be fair, like they are actually already pretty portable if you think about it, right? Like they came a long way, because like back in the 60s when laser cutting was introduced, people would have to write like custom control for the motors that were driving their laser cutter. Then later in the 80s, that kind of the standard of G code was adopted to kind of as an interface to kind of connect with laser cutters, and it was already invented in the 50s, but only used as the standard in laser cutting since the 80s, and later in the 2000s, we saw like line drawing 2D cutting plans coming up. So we already managed to go away like many steps away from the specifics of the hardware, but there are still some fundamental problems in these 2D cutting plans. So if I look at this microscope model that you see here, there are like a lot of all these different parts they need to connect with one another. So for example, this thing here, this little prong here needs to fit inside this cutout when I want to assemble this model, which is all fine in principle. But if I have a different laser cutter than the original person who manufactured this thing, it might be that my laser cutter removes more material than the original. And you see that if that happens, the prong here gets smaller and the cutout gets wider. So this thing will not fit together anymore. The same thing happens when the machine removes too little material, right? Like it's like now this prong gets too big and the cutout gets smaller. So as a result, it will probably not even fit together. And the same thing happens here, for example. Here is like an axle that needs to be held in place by a bearing. And again, like if the cutout gets bigger, we end up with an axle that ends up wobbling in that bearing. So it will not work. It will jam itself in place at some point. And so just like thinking about these two issues would be sort of similar to creating the PDF format for laser cutting, which is a format that continues to work on any machine. And in this case, it would work in any laser cutter. But there is something even more nasty here, Like this is a microscope model, as I said before, right? So if I want to change the dimensions of this model, if I want to say make the neck longer of the microscope, we end up with much more complicated transitions. You would have to make a lot of changes in that SVG cutting plan because it's represented in 2D to figure out how to kind of modify that model. That would be, if we again like use the metaphor with desktop publishing, would be the same as like having access to the actual source code, right? If you want to make like parametric changes to the model. And so let me just start by like investigating these two issues at the bottom here. This sort of establishing the PDF for laser cutting. So this was my first attempt because I wanted to kind of keep these 2D cutting plans around, right? There's a lot of great things about them, as I already mentioned. So I was like wondering if I can somehow save that format and then make it better so that it continues to work on any laser cutter. So we wrote a semi-automatic software tool that converts a non-portable SVG file into a portable SVG file. And there are two publications that are related to that in the last two iterations of WIST. So the way this works is it's a TypeScript application that runs in the browser, and it loads an SVG cutting plan directly into that application. And now as a user, you come in and you kind of make some modifications to the model. And right now, you'll just see this quickly without understanding completely what's going on. But I will show this video again later, and then you have the context to kind of figure out what is happening here. But the gist is, as a user, I make some edits in that model. I place some additional cutouts in there. And the great thing is, it's already a 2D cutting plan. It's already an SVG, so I can send it straight away to the laser cutter. There's nothing more I have to do here. And so the goal is to take this microscope, which is optimized to work on one particular fabrication machine and in one particular material, and to turn it into this microscope, which looks very similar if you look at it at first. But if you look in detail here, there's like, I made these joints, I changed them, I made them portable. And I modified this mechanism here. I also made that portable. So let's look at the joints first. So this is what the joint that side plate looks like of the microscope when we zoom in all the way to that cutout. And you see indeed that like the gray zone here is like the amount of material that could be removed if your laser cutter removes more material than another one. And as a result, like these joints that are press fit together, they really are like relying on a very high degree of stiffness here. And so minor changes in kerf, they kind of make this fail. They make this thing not work out. So what we do instead is like we take that joint cut out and we add this cantilever spring right next to it. And the great thing is now we actually, rather than relying on the compression of the material, we rely on bending of the material, right? So you see that there is a larger tolerance for which this joint continues to work. And so we use that approach to convert all the joints and mounts in the different models into kerf-independent joints and mounts. So like here you see like some finger joints, and you see here also like the hole here that has to hold this button in place. They're all turned into cantilever-based versions of the same mechanisms. And the same model now continues to work not only in plywood, but also, for example, here in acrylic. So we call this software tool SpringFit. It's a software tool that detects joints and mounts in models and replaces them with portable equivalents that are tolerant to variations in kerf. But it's not quite the complete story, right? Like remember, I showed you this microscope, and there was also this mechanism there, this bearing. And the thing with the bearing is that like you want to hold that axle in place, but you don't really want to put a spring right next to that, right? Because if you were to do that, you would actually introduce friction into the mechanism, which is the opposite of why you want to use a bearing in the first place. So I was wondering if I can, again, save the day here by modifying that bearing in a way so that it continues to work even if the kerf or the material changes. And we achieved that by placing this additional inset right next to the bearing here. We zoom into that. So it's some sort of crescent-shaped inset that we just jam next to the axle here. And that actually turns out to work and continues to hold that bearing in place even if the kerf changes. Let's see how that works. So here is the bearing which has to hold the axle in place. And as I increase the amount of kerf in the mechanism, you see that like the inset changes in shape a little bit, but we constantly jam it further in. And if you've paid attention, you see that like at all times the inset closes the gap exactly, right? So the gap that is caused by kerf is always closed. So the bearing is always holding that axle in place. And all the user needed to do here is just jam the inset in place. So it doesn't need to understand how kerf works or how materials work or any of those. You just take the inset, you jam it in the cutout, and then you're good to go. So let's look at from a more technical perspective what's going on here. So the inset consists of two key elements: the outside curvature, which we refer to as a jammer, and the inside curvature, which we refer to as an inverse scalar. So if you look at the jammer in isolation, we see that it has the shape of a self-similar Nautilus spiral. And the great thing of this geometry is that if we apply kerf to that inset, it gets smaller, which makes sense. But it does get, the curvature doesn't change on the outside. So there's also always going to be a moment, if we rotate it in place, where it's going to jam inside its own cutout. And then it holds itself in place really well. So the jammer holds that inset in place. And in turn, the inverse scalar now has to hold the axle in place. And the way this works is, again, actually based on the same philosophy. So the inverse scalar is derived from a similar spiral, but now it's flipped. So as more kerf results in more rotation of the inset, the cutout gets actually smaller by exactly the same amount. It gets compensated for again. And that results in bearings that are of constant size. So if you look at here, like you have like simulated the amount of kerf in different bearings, and you see that like even though the kerf goes up, the bearing is constantly holding the axle reliably in place, even if you would mill the same cutout. So for that reason, we call these mechanisms kerf canceling mechanisms. They are mechanisms that continue to perform their functionality independent of the amount of material that's removed by the fabrication machine, which is known as kerf. So if we now look back at the initial kind of walkthrough of the editor, you have some sort of sense of what's going on. So we loaded that microscope cutting plan in here. And ahead of time, Kerf Canceller tried to guess what possible mechanisms are in there, but it cannot get everything right. For example, there is a sliding mechanism here. And in 2D cutting plan, that's represented by a simple rectangle. So there's no way for like Kerf Canceller to know that this thing has to be a sliding mechanism. So this is where the user comes in and annotates these cutting plans with additional information. So here we place a sliding mechanism on top of that rectangular cutout that we found. We tell where the gears are, because again, the gears are not encoded in the 2D cutting plan. And then we have to also remove some guesses that were wrong. So there were like some things where Kerf Canceller thought there might be a mechanism, but there is not really a mechanism there. For example, the glare hole here that we are looking through in the microscope. And then when everything is done, you just save the file. And again, as I said before, you send it to the laser cutter right away. And you can now send it to any laser cutter. So this microscope here continues to work irrespective of variations of kerf or material, even if you would fabricate it on, for example, a milling machine. So another subtractive fabrication technology. And so we use that software to convert a whole range of objects that we found in online repositories to kerf independent things. And we now fabricate on any laser cutter and in a range of materials. All right, so how far did we get so far? Like I promised you portability. And I think with what the approach that I've shown you so far, we're essentially, we have achieved portability, because these models, they will fabricate on any laser cutter. They work on a range of materials. And so like in many ways, this is sort of the same as a PDF, which you can just open on any device, it reliably works. But I don't know about you, but if I look at some of these models, we did something like it came at a cost. It didn't come for free, right? The cost here is that if you have a lot of joints, like for example, here, these finger joints that are lined up with each other, it has some sort of aesthetic, quality to it. You may or may not like it, but it certainly has also a structural quality to it, right? It decreases the structural integrity of the overall model. And that is fine for most laser cut models, because they tend to be very, very sturdy in the first place. They are excessively sturdy because like the material is just very rigid by itself. But it's a trade-off that you need to make. If you really want to optimize your model, this may not be the best way of solving it. But more importantly, I made a bigger promise at the beginning, right? Like I said it like I want to be able to modify that microscope. So if you look at the microscope again, the 2D cutting plan here, if I want to change the length of this neck here, that actually got even harder because I added additional cutouts in the cutting plan now. So let's see if there's a different approach, a different route without like necessarily saving the 2D cutting plans. There's another way of solving this problem. So in 3D, this would be a different problem. Right? Here's an example of a VR headset. And I don't know if you've seen like Google Cardboard or like other like kind of VR headsets lately. You put your phone in the front and you look through like a bunch of lenses, and that gives you a reasonable VR experience because like there's a divider between your eyes. So you're left eye gets different content from the right eye, and that's then displayed on your phone. So it's a very cheap way to very quickly have a reasonable VR experience. But the model that you see here is not a particularly inclusive model if you think about it, right? It's like if I talk about millions of people using fabrication, this model is made for one particular user, right? It's like it's one specific shape of your forehead. It's like one interocular distance between your eyes and one prescription, for example, right? Like it's like I would probably want to modify that model in order to make it work for me. What I would want to do is like I want to stretch the front of that VR headset further away, so that it will fit my prescription. And in 3D, you would do it like this, right? Like you would take a stretching tool, you would take the model and just stretch the front plate backwards. So now I could adjust it to my prescription. I would be able to fabricate it and have a meaningful model. But this is not how I find that model in the first place. If I go to an online repository, this is what I end up finding, right? A 2D cutting plan, as we've been discussing so far. And so it works a little different here, right? If I want to make that same transition, if I want to, again, stretch that front plate forwards of the VR headset, I would, logically modify that plate that sits on top of that VR headset. But when I modify this, then I will have to make sure that all the plates that connect to this plate are also modified accordingly, right? So I would, for example, have to modify this side plate here, because like otherwise you would somehow like skew the model instead of stretching it straight forwards. And I'm going to need your help here. So I don't know if you have like if you can use like a virtual hand or like a checkbox or something to indicate what I need to change in order to solve this problem. So I would like you to vote if you think that these have to change. Like would these parts in the model have to change? Just raise your hand or virtual hand if you think so. What about this plate here? Would that have to change? Maybe. I think I would change this plate because like this is sort of the opposite of that top plate. Like this is the plate on the bottom. So if I stretch only the top plate, then I would skew the model forwards. And by stretching both at the same time, I would actually be able to kind of go straight. What about this plate here? I think that has to change. I think so too, right? Like so if you didn't modify this plate, again, like you would sort of warp the model instead of like stretching it forward. And so like you want to make the same transition here. You also want to kind of stretch it longer. This plate. How about this one here? So I would agree. I would also not modify this one. This one actually turned out to be very interesting. Like we had expected that we would not have to change it because it doesn't connect to the other plates that I've been stretching here. But it turns out that it's the divider between your eyes, right? Like so, like if you don't make that longer at that point, the left eye will see the content of the right eye and the other way around. So for the optical VR experience, you actually want to modify this one too. But the main gist is that in order to find out what you need to change, like there turns out to be some ambiguity, right? Some discussion already, even within our lab, we had discussion about this. But the main thing is in order to kind of come to this conclusion, what you end up doing, I think, is like you imagine what the 3D model looks like of these plates, what the transition looks like in 3D, and then that's what you end up executing back to the 2D cutting plan to figure out which plates to modify. And so I can't help but wonder that like what it would be like if we truly had this model in 3D in the first place, right? And so while I was doing the research that I presented so far, at the lab we started a bigger project, which is called kyub, where we build a 3D modeling environment for laser cutting. So here's a bit of a preview of how that works. So I'm trying to model an espresso machine here for laser cutting. And so this is what the kyub editor allows me to do. So like very quickly, it allows me to kind of stack together a bunch of boxes and build like the shape of that espresso machine. And then with additional tools, I can kind of fine tune that geometry and get away from the boxy sort of structure and make it something that is more interesting, more close to what an espresso machine would really look like. And of course, we want to put a logo on it because we can. And there you go, right? Like, so in like a couple of minutes, like, I mean, this was sped up, but then still like in less than 5 minutes, you would be able to model a complete espresso machine and then fabricate it. And from a portability perspective, I mean, this is great in terms of like UI, but from a portability perspective, what is really nice here is that you would now also be able to export it for your particular laser cutter. So you don't need to worry that it works on any laser cutter. You just like make sure it works very well for yours, because that's the one that you end up fabricating on. You do that in this case, for example, by defining the kerf, right? Like these controlling the parameters that are varying when you change the laser cutter. And you would then end up with the plates that are exported. And in many cases, for most users, you may not know what the kerf of your laser cutter is. And then you would be able to indicate that, and then you get like a kerf strip to measure it with a test cut yourself. So we have like 500 beta users of kyub. So we have like a large repository of things that people have been building. And the great thing is like all these models are now usable. They are inherently parametric, right? They can be fabricated on any laser cutter, and you can easily make any modification to it if you want to. And everything is shared, so like you can just completely start building on the work of others. So with kyub, in many ways we're done here, right? Like I've solved all three problems here, like the issue of being able to not fabricate on a different laser cutter, and the ability to modify the model in the first place. But there is a bit of an itch here. Like there are a lot of like great models out there. There's a lot of engineering knowledge that went into all the models that are being shared up to now. And that goes for the online sharing community, but even more so also for like entire companies that built like their expertise in making these really beautiful 2D cutting plans with a lot of like valuable engineering knowledge in there. And you know, as long as these 2D cutting plans are around, and then people have invested so much, like entire careers, into making these things work, as long as they are around, I think they will remain the standard. Right? There's just nothing I can, as a researcher, I can cheer that like we all need to start modeling in 3D, but like in order to really make a difference, I need to do something more here, I think. Because the problem with standards is, well, they tend to stick. So I don't know if any of you are playing guitar, but like by the time I was born, this is how people shared the guitar tabs, which is an ASCII format. It has like all the information in place that you know you need in principle to be able to play this riff here. But it turns out that this is something I downloaded just a few months ago, right? Like, so nothing has changed. It just worked well enough so that it will continue to stay around, even though there are better ways of doing this at this point. Like we could come up with way better ways of encoding these guitar riffs if we wanted to. It just doesn't change because it just seems to work reasonably well. And I'm afraid that if that is the case for 2D cutting plans as well, we will, instead of making this transformation to the VR headset, we will just end up doing this, right? We will still have to imagine what the 3D model looks like, envisioning what the changes in 3D are, and then like executing that back to the 2D cutting plan. And so we ran a user study to find out how complicated that really is. And it turned out that on average, it took participants 24 minutes to change that VR headset that we just looked at together. And 11 out of 13 models failed when we tried to fabricate them, because like joints didn't line up, parts didn't connect together well. So not great. It's not something you want everybody to start doing, especially if we talk about millions of users here. So we thought like, well, if that's something we have to do, if you have to envision what the 3D model looks like, why don't we make it easy to do that? Why don't we write software that allows you to make that workaround easier somehow? And this is where assembler kyub comes in. So there already is software that allows you to go from 3D to 2D, right? That's kyub, what I showed before. But there's nothing that allows you to go from these 2D cutting plans up to a 3D model. That's where assembler kyub comes in. And even though this feels like an additional workaround, it turns out that this workflow is 10 times faster than a traditional workflow. And all models, they continue to work as a result. So let's look at what is going on here, what that trick is to go from 2D to 3D. Here's a bit of a preview video of like how you load essentially the 2D cutting plan into that editor, the 3D editor that we looked at before. And it then allows you to sort of click together the model, if you will. So you're sort of puzzling together this VR headset in the 3D modeling environment. So that's an algorithm which we call assembler kyub. It's a 5-step algorithm that converts 2D laser cutting formats into 3D models. And let's look at what these steps are. So we take a 2D cutting plan, and first we try to detect the individual plates in that model. Then we detect the joints on those plates. We use that information to derive the material thickness of the individual plates. And we then try to pair up the different joints with each other. We try to figure out like what joints could possibly match with each other. And in the last step, users semi-automatically assemble the model. And so in the interest of time for this talk, I'm going to focus on the last two steps of that algorithm. Those are the kind of the juicy bits. They're the more interesting parts of what's going on here. So we've already kind of figured out what are the plates in the model, and we've already identified the joints and the material thickness of this model. And now we're like left with this VR headset that we're looking at here. And we need to figure out like what joints could possibly match up with each other. And so I'm going to use your help here again to figure that out, because like this is something that you guys will all kind of do fantastic at, I think. So we have this plate here, and you all kind of sort of seen the 3D model before. So now let's see what that would connect to. So who thinks that this plate connects to this plate here? Not quite. What about this plate? About this one here? See, like HCIL is like having a green checkbox. Yeah, this is indeed like this plate would fit into this joint here. No, this plate here. Right. Also, exactly, it's the same thing again. Like it connects to both of those on top and the bottom. And so, like I think as you were like trying to figure out what joints pair up with each other, what you've probably been doing is like you've looked at like the shape of the joint here and imagined a 3D model in your head, right? But you look at the shape of the joint and you try to figure out like, okay, where could this possibly fit into? And you know, it's sort of clear that it doesn't fit with this joint here, for example, right? It's clearly different. And you can all tell just by like staring at this model. But for an algorithm to make that decision, it will have to compare every joint to every other joint, right? Which at best would result in quadratic complexity, but probably even worse because there are differences within the model of different types of joints as well. So we try to kind of get that intuition of like, okay, this joint clearly doesn't fit with this joint here. We try to encapsulate that intuition in the software to make this tractable. And the way we did that is by storing all the joints in a table and then using a lookup table and then like using a key to find which joint could belong to which other joint, which is known as a hash data structure. And so the way you would like hash these joints, it's like you would try to kind of get their shape, like their functional shape in that hash, and then find out what it would pair up with. So let's look at this joint to kind of figure out how to do that. So our first intuition was to just take the size of the fingers here and say like, well, if there's something that matches to that size of the fingers, we will probably have a great match here. But it turns out that this finger here mates with something that is slightly smaller somewhere else in the model. Because again, like kerf, right? Like people have compensated their model so that the finger does not need to fit to exactly the same size because the material that's removed by the laser cutter would make this model fail. So instead, we're looking for another feature somewhere that is slightly smaller. And slightly smaller is really, really complicated for a hash data structure, right? You're just not going to find a match then. It's pretty messed up. But the good news is that right next to this finger, there's a cutout. And that cutout is compensated by exactly the same amount, right? Like it's like where the finger is made bigger, the cutout is made smaller in order to compensate for kerf. And so if you take the sum of these two, you actually have like a metric that is independent of variations in kerf. And that will allow you to find like matching joints somewhere else in the model. So we take the sum of these two as the signature, and that's how we hash every joint in the hash. And so now when I look up this signature in that hash, I find a bunch of collisions in the hash, and those are like marked here in orange. So those are the only candidates I have to kind of consider when I try to find out where this joint could possibly pair up with. Now it's still 6 alternatives, which is not ideal, right? Like you would sort of hope that now there was one candidate and then we would be done, because then you just know that these two plates fit together. So in order to do that last step of disambiguation, we bring in the user actually. So this is what you've seen before, right? Like, so you load the 2D cutting plan into the editor. And a user now starts to essentially puzzle it together. And you see it every time I click one of these plates, it highlights all the possible joint candidates. So it gives some sort of sense of what I could possibly do with every plate. And sometimes the orientation is wrong of a plate. And then you have this rotate icon that sits right next to the plate, which you can click to sort of override the suggestion of the system. But in this case, it was actually right in the first place. So we just undo that and then continue to assemble the model. And you see that like most of the time, there's only like one or two alternatives for every joint that you would pair up with. So like it's reasonably tractable for a user to puzzle together the VR headset here. And the nice thing is that we are in a 3D modeling environment all along. So I can now make that change to the prescription that I wanted to make to the VR headset using just a different tool in the same modeling environment. So I just use the stretch tool here and then modify that VR headset. And so we use that algorithm and that approach to take 100 models that we found in online repositories and turn them into the 3D models. So it's just sort of nice to watch. Like here's like a chair being assembled. Some candle holder. Birdhouse. You see that like every now and then the algorithm still gets it wrong, right? Like so the orientation of a plate is off or something, but then it's like one or two clicks of that rotate icon to typically get the plates in the right orientation. Here's the microscope we looked at earlier. A Raspberry Pi rack, because that's like what makers tend to make to mine their Bitcoins. A test tube rack. And of course, we could also not resist the urge to reconstruct a dinosaur. And 100 other models that we found in online repositories. And the great thing is that all of these models now exist in a 3D format. So they are all inherently, you can make parametric modifications to these, and they will fabricate on any laser cutter, unlike the format in which they were shared before that. And so here's a bit of a preview of like what is coming up next from my side. So the last step, if you really want to make this transition truly accessible to everyone, we want to remove one more hurdle of complexity for the user. And that is, you can sort of puzzle together the VR headset if you know how it works, right? And you saw like, as we were trying to do this together, you may or may not have succeeded at figuring out exactly how all the parts work. So it requires some sort of knowledge of how laser cutting works and how joints work and all that. And we sort of want to drop that because that still limits the accessibility of laser cutting to only those people with that knowledge. So in the last step, we are trying to push this further by automating that entire workflow. And so the way we do this now is like we just have the same dialogue again, right? You import the VR headset in this case. And in the background now, the algorithm starts to beam search the alternatives and figure out like exported exponential space of like different ways in which you can connect the plates, to then immediately have a VR headset in the editor, which you can now modify. And that's, of course, what you might want as a user if you're not interested in the fabrication in the first place. You just want to make the modification and send the model out for fabrication. So this is how the algorithm works in the background. So it picks the plate with the most joints, and then it tries to connect all the other plates to that plate. It assesses those plates with a score, and that evaluates how close to a good assembly it looks according to the heuristics that we developed for this. And then we pick the 4 best candidates and continue to recursively iterate this and use this algorithm to kind of find new assemblies. You see that like in the end, after we do this a bunch of steps, we actually end up with that VR headset. And here's just a couple of other models that we end up like kind of assembling that way. And so you see, like in a couple of seconds, typically less than 2 seconds, actually, we end up with like a model that you can then import into the editor right away without even having to understand how this works in the backend. And then you can make your parametric modifications to it. It's like a desktop organizer. All right. So in conclusion, I've shown you 3 kind of fundamental problems that are currently there in the 2D cutting plans that we are sharing, and then people are sharing in the laser cutting community. We identified the 3 problems and found solutions for each of these. And I've shown you like how to tackle some of these issues by going towards a 3D format. So it's kind of transitioning away from a 2D format, using a 3D format to encapsulate the information. And then we presented Assembler Cube as like a software tool that allows you to kind of make that transition happen somehow. So that is like, I hope that sort of solves portability in the context of laser cutting, which is the ability of models to be transferred from one machine or system to another. And if any of the other fields of digital content that we've seen in the past are some sort of indicator, then this might be a moment where after we actually achieve this milestone of portability in the context of laser cutting, we would have models that continue to be relevant, that continue to be useful for other users after they've been fabricated. And so if when I convince my students in Introduction to Programming that compilers were like the main transition where we went from thousands of users to millions of users of computing, I hope that I have in this talk convinced you that like the kind of the same step to transition from thousands of users of fabrication to millions of users is to abstract away from the hardware and to, in this case, encode laser cut models in 3D. And you know, like then we can start dreaming about what the next big transition is, and maybe that is going to be mobile. But let's see, like that's the next kind of thing that can happen after we figure out the portability transition towards billions of users. So on that note, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to a discussion with all of you.
All right, thanks, Thijs. It's a really exciting topic. Do we have questions from the audience? I can start one if you want.
Also, can you take off your share screen so that we can, thanks.
Right. I really like your work. I mean, I'm in the same community, so I know many of your works already. Right. I also like the way that you draw the analogies between what you're doing to, like, say, the 80s or 70s when the PDF became the standard, and the compilers promote, as you said, thousands of millions of people start to use the same things. I was wondering, so when you mention the PDF, there's one thing that comes to my mind is, one of the reasons people want to use PDF or want to see the digital information is because there's a strong need to read digital information on the screens, right? And that will be more convenient. It will be easier for people to do text editing as well. So there's a strong need from the user side to do this. What do you think would be the killer app? What do you think would be the strong need for the end users to want to do laser cutters at their homes to build all sorts of things? Because with the applications or examples you showed in the talk, you showed how people can do VR goggles or chairs or tables or microscopes, all sorts of things. But we sort of already have that existed in your environment, and we can just buy that from Amazon or shoppings. Right. So what do you think would be the strong need from the users end that this can be like why we want to scale up that?
Right. Yeah. It's a great question, and it's sort of like the metaphor, the parallel you mentioned yourself of like Amazon is sort of the big competitor, I think, of digital fabrication. It's like a little bit independent of laser cutting. It's like, I think most people, when they need a product, they will probably just kind of buy the product, right? Like if Amazon gets better, gets faster, it's like there is going to be a moment where the time it takes for Amazon to get the product to you is shorter than it would take to fabricate it yourself somehow, which, you know, is a great step forwards, I think. I mean, there's a lot of like advantages to that. The main disadvantage is that like what Amazon is really good with is with mass-produced objects. And I think whenever it comes to objects that you might end up customizing, that you want to kind of make work for yourself, for your particular needs, that is where digital fabrication plays a bigger role. That's why, for example, I showed that VR headset that is like, yes, it's possible to just have like the general purpose one, but you really want to kind of tune it to your particular needs. And I think that is sort of, in general for fabrication, sort of the killer, if you will, right? Like if fabrication were to succeed, I think there's like two tracks there. It's like the ability to customize, and then it would still be possible that like Amazon fabricates it, but that you would be able to have like that model that you wanted to have rather than the off-the-shelf sort of like default object. And so like that's a little bit orthogonal to laser cutting in this case. It's digital fabrication in general. And so I think in particular with laser cutting, what we found a really, really big use case is educational context. So the main advantage of laser cutting over 3D printing is that it's much, much faster, and that you can use natural materials. And these two kind of make that, like, for example, what we've done, we had like a class where we had like people build like cajons and other like instruments, for example. You can design them and fabricate them within the same session, if you will. And that is something that is like unheard of in any other context somehow, right? It's the fact that you created that model yourself And then the ability to also kind of have the actual model within the same class is very powerful, I think, for laser cutting particularly. But I think like my work is in general, like I focused on laser cutting because that's sort of the context that I could tackle within the scope of a PhD. But I think the whole question of portability goes much further than just laser cutting itself. And it sort of applies to any fabrication technology, if you will. Like in laser cutting, it seems somewhat obvious to go from 2D to 3D to sort of solve the problem of the joints and how things interlock with each other. But in 3D modeling, you have the same type of problems, really. Like, so if you're 3D printing something, you would describe the shape of the object. And shape is very interesting if you want to make like a cute figurine that you put somewhere in your house and that you will never look at again. But I think there are much more interesting dimensions to these models. Like, for example, the compliance of a material, or like I looked at for some project at KAI 2016 into like how to make mechanisms that interlock with each other. These are things that are higher level dimensions that you actually might want to share, right? You might want to, rather than sharing the shape of a model, you want to share this higher level of abstraction that actually sort of encodes that higher dimension of what you're trying to achieve with your model, the purpose of the model, if you will. And I think that is sort of something that kind of connects to any fabrication technology, and therefore like there is much more that we can still do in this space. And then the other thing is like when Amazon really wins, as long as you are like at home in your office in a predefined context. And that's why I believe that mobility is sort of the final answer to success in fabrication. When you're on the go, when you're not able to kind of, order something and solve your problem, if you want to solve your mechanical problems on the go, you will need a different solution. And I think that is where mobile fabrication actually can play an enormous role in the future. We're not quite there yet. So there's more work to be done.
Thanks. Other questions from the audience? We have one from Anna. Do you want me to repeat, or you can just, maybe just take from here? We have one question in the chat.
Oh, I see. Shall I just read it out, or like, yeah, I guess. So could any of the algorithms you've worked on be retrofitted to convert standard 3D models, STL or STEP, to a laser cutter plan? Not sure if this already exists. That's an interesting question. It's like if you wanted to speed up your fabrication process, for example, you might want to do that, right? Like you might want to take a 3D model and then convert it to something that you can laser cut. And this is a colleague of mine actually has done work on this like back in 2014, I think, called Platner. So Stephanie Muller, she kind of published a paper on that, where you indeed take a 3D model and you kind of either convert it completely to a laser cut geometry, or you kind of select the areas in there that you would convert into a laser cut model, because that would be faster to fabricate. You can speed up your prototyping process, if you will. So there's certainly some technology there. So I think the algorithms that I've particularly worked on are very focused on kind of going the other way, right? Taking the lack of information that you have in the 2D cutting plans and seeing if you can somehow, turn it into a 3D model, or kind of derive the other information that is missing from the 2D cutting plan. But like, yeah, there is certainly also ways to go the other way around, and it is a very interesting thing to do, especially if you're prototyping or if you want to make like many quick versions of a model. There are more questions? You can also just unmute yourself and then ask straight on. That might be easier.
What do you think if you can combine laser cutters with some of the external component that can just buy that can actually make things move, right? So what I see here is like to make things really become scale up, you need to worry about things not just on the shape or structures, but also about functionalities. So any comment on that?
Yes, fully agreed. A very good point. I do not believe that the future of fabrication is that we will kind of work with one specific fabrication technology and in one specific fabrication environment, for that matter. Like what you've seen so far is a 3D modeling environment for laser cutting, which makes sense if you're just interested in laser cutting itself. But I think if you look around you in your house, there are no products that are made with one single fabrication technology and one single material. That's very unlikely. And so I think the real value of any fabrication technology is like when we start to integrate these different processes together. So this is something that we're actually looking into as well. Like we've lately built actual complete Western guitars with laser cutting, but then all the other components need to be embedded in the model as well. So like we embed these, like, so we are looking into like creating interfaces in the laser cut model where you specify other models that would come in. So like this could be a 3D printed model. This could just be like the mechanics of the guitar or the strings of the guitar, for example. But it could also be like something that is like made with a completely different fabrication technique. So I think that, so this is something that we're doing right now. It's just like literally like just placing these different components on the laser cut model. So if you want like a key example that we used is like in class, we actually had like students build robots with like laser cut geometry and then like motors and other kind of actuators in there. So that was a great step forward. But I think the true answer here is like when we really start to specify these interfaces between materials. So like if you really get to the point where you have like you're using a laser cutting editor to make the laser cut parts, and then you specify an interface, and from there on you connect 3D printed geometry in there. So you would create like a connector on the laser cut side, you would create a connector on the 3D printed side, so they would interlock with each other. And then you can continue modeling the 3D model in 3D somehow, right? In another modeling environment. I think that is sort of the point where we really kind of start building interesting stuff, you know, like beyond, like I think everything that is made with one fabrication technology is only interesting for people who are necessarily excited about the technology itself, right? So like those people, like the models that you saw that I reconstructed, those are all made by people who are very excited about laser cutting, right? They bought a laser cutter probably, and then they were just wondering, what can I do with a laser cutter? So they started to create these models. That does not really reflect these millions of views that I talked about, right? Like, I mean, if you think of like, I don't know, an uncle or so that you have who is not into fabrication at all, they're probably not interested in this. Like, they're just like, why would I necessarily want to laser cut something? I want to have that table that I want to have, like, or I want to have that chair that I want to have, and I don't care how it is fabricated. And so, like, I think that is sort of the point when we really like transition towards a larger use base. We need to start considering that transition as well. It's a different mindset that we need to kind of cater to. And so, yeah, I believe that like the interface between different fabrication technologies, both on a fabrication level and on an editing, like a modeling level, are going to be fundamental in moving forwards on this.
All right. I guess if we don't have more questions from the audience, let's thank guys again for joining us to give this very amazing talk and about digital fabrication.
Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure being here.
We really appreciate you joining us. I have a few closing words, if that would be okay. Next time, Alex Leach, one of our professors, will